The gas station was deserted, the cold wind whistling through the empty pumps. He waited. Hours turned into days. His amber eyes never wavered from the road. And then, something changed. The gas station stood on the outskirts of a quiet town, a lone structure against the vast openness of the road. It was the kind of place where people only stopped for a moment, just long enough to fill up their tank, grab a coffee, and disappear back into the endless stretch of highway. The wind carried the scent of asphalt and gasoline, blending with the dry air of late summer. But in this place of fleeting moments, one figure remained unmoving: a German shepherd. He had been there for days. His fur, once a deep, proud sable, was now coated with dust from the road. His ears twitched at every passing vehicle, his amber eyes locked onto the horizon as if waiting for something, or someone. He wasn't a stray. No, there was something too purposeful about the way he sat, too patient in the way he watched the road. Roy, the gas station's lone attendant, had been the first to notice him. The dog had arrived late one evening, trotting in with an alert but calm demeanor, his tongue lolling from exhaustion. At first, Roy assumed he belonged to a traveler, someone who had stepped inside to pay for their gas. But when the last car pulled away and the station fell silent under the weight of night, the shepherd remained. "Where's your owner, boy?" Roy had murmured, standing in the dim glow of the station lights. The dog had only flicked his ears at the voice, but his gaze never left the road. Roy wasn't the kind of man to get involved in things that weren't his business. He was in his late 50s, a man who had seen enough in life to know that some things didn't have explanations. He'd spent his years working gas stations, small diners, and roadside motels, places where people came and went, but never stayed. He liked the quiet. He didn't ask questions, but something about the dog gnawed at him. By the second day, the shepherd still hadn't moved far from the pumps. He sat in the same spot, watching the road with unwavering determination. Occasionally, he would stand, his ears perking up as a car approached, only to lower his head in quiet disappointment as it passed. It was as if he was waiting for someone to return. "Someone left you behind, didn't they?" Roy muttered one morning as he sipped his coffee, watching the dog through the station's window. That thought unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. On the third day, Roy took a can of beef jerky from the station's supply shelf, kneeling a few feet away from the shepherd. He held out a small piece, watching the dog's reaction. The shepherd hesitated. He sniffed the air, eyes flicking to Roy with cautious curiosity. Then, after a long pause, he took a careful step forward, lowering his head to take the offering before retreating to his spot near the pumps. Roy exhaled, shaking his head. "Guess you're not too proud to eat, huh?" By the fourth day, the dog had become a local mystery. Travelers who stopped for gas noticed him, some offering food, others trying to call him over. But the shepherd never left his post. The road was his focus, his mission. A young trucker, passing through on his way to Texas, watched the dog with quiet sympathy. "Ain't never seen a dog that loyal," he muttered as he handed Roy a $5 bill. "Buy him some real food, will ya?" Roy smirked, tucking the bill into his pocket. "I'll see what I can do." That evening, Roy placed a bowl of water and a plate of leftover chicken near the gas pumps. The shepherd approached slowly, sniffing the food before cautiously eating. But even as he ate, his ears remained pricked, his gaze flickering back to the road every few seconds. He was waiting. It was the kind of loyalty Roy had only ever seen in old war stories. Soldiers who never left their posts. Men who waited for comrades long after the battle had ended. By the fifth day, Roy had grown attached in a way he hadn't expected. He found himself checking on the dog first thing in the morning and lingering at the station longer than usual, just to keep him company. "You're stubborn, I'll give you that," Roy muttered as he crouched near the dog that evening. "But you can't wait forever, boy." The shepherd only blinked at him, his deep brown eyes filled with a quiet certainty. By the sixth day, A small crowd had begun to form in the afternoons. Curious travelers who had heard about the waiting dog. People took pictures, shared stories, and speculated about where he had come from. Maybe his owner was in an accident, one woman mused. Could be military trained, said another man. Dogs like that, they don't forget their partners. Roy listened, but he didn't need theories. He could see the truth in the shepherd's unwavering stance. The dog wasn't lost. He wasn't searching. He knew exactly where he was supposed to be. Still, the thought of him waiting forever sent a small pang of sadness through Roy's chest. He wasn't a sentimental man, but he knew what it felt like to wait for something that was never coming back. That night, as the sky turned into a sea of deep indigo and the stars flickered above the empty highway, Roy walked over with a leash he had found in the back of the station. "All right, boy," he said softly, crouching near him. "Let's get you somewhere safe." The shepherd didn't move. Roy sighed, placing the leash on the ground between them. "I ain't gonna force you," he murmured. "But you deserve better than this." The dog only turned his head slightly, his ears twitching as a car approached in the distance. Roy followed his gaze, watching as headlights pierced the darkness. The shepherd stood. For the first time in days, his body tensed, not with disappointment, but with something else. Hope. As the car slowed near the gas station, Roy felt his breath catch. Something was about to change. The night air was thick with silence, save for the distant hum of crickets and the occasional whisper of wind brushing against the gas station's faded sign. Roy's breath felt heavier than usual as he watched the approaching vehicle, its headlights cutting through the darkness like twin beacons. The German shepherd stood alert, his body rigid with anticipation. Roy had seen this before. How the dog would react to passing cars, how his ears would perk up, how his body would lean forward as if preparing to run. But this time was different. The dog wasn't just watching. He knew. The car rolled to a slow stop near the pumps, its engine humming before falling silent. The vehicle was nothing special, an old sedan, paint faded by time and dust clinging stubbornly to its frame. The driver's door creaked open, and from the shadows emerged a man. Roy didn't recognize him, but the shepherd did. Without hesitation, the dog let out a sharp bark, his tail wagging once before he bolted forward. It was the first time in a week Roy had seen him move with such urgency. He ran toward the man, his paws barely touching the ground, his eyes alight with something Roy could only describe as pure relief. The man, dressed in a worn leather jacket and jeans that had seen better days, staggered back in shock as the shepherd leaped onto him, whining, nudging, licking his face with frantic desperation. "Whoa! Whoa! Easy, boy!" the man gasped, stumbling against the car. Roy took a step forward, heart hammering against his ribs. The man dropped to his knees, his hands buried in the thick fur of the shepherd's neck. His voice cracked as he whispered, "Duke? Oh my God. Duke?" The dog whimpered, pressing his face into the man's chest as if trying to melt into him, as if afraid this moment would slip away like a dream. Roy stood frozen, watching as something heavy unfolded before him. A reunion. A reckoning. Finally, he found his voice. "He's been waiting for you," Roy murmured, his own throat tightening at the sight before him. The man lifted his head, eyes glassy under the dim station lights. "Waiting?" Roy nodded. "For days. Never left that spot, not once." The man exhaled sharply, running a shaking hand over his face. Jesus. He swallowed hard, looking down at the shepherd, at Duke, as if seeing something he never thought he'd see again. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "I never meant to leave him." Roy frowned. "What happened?" The man hesitated. Then, with a deep, steadying breath, he began. "His name's Duke. He's my dog. Has been since he was a pup. We used to be inseparable." He scratched Duke behind the ears, his fingers trembling slightly. I was traveling for work, passing through this town. Stopped at this gas station for a quick break. I let Duke out to stretch his legs, and then… He looked away, jaw tightening. I got a call. It was my brother. He got into an accident. I panicked. I didn't even think. Just jumped in the car and drove straight to the hospital. His voice broke, thick with guilt. By the time I realized Duke wasn't in the car, I was miles away. Roy felt a deep pang in his chest. I came back, the man said quickly, almost as if he was trying to defend himself. I swear I did. The next morning I drove straight back, but he was gone. I thought maybe someone picked him up, maybe he wandered off. I searched everywhere, left my number at shelters, even called the station here, but nothing. His hands clenched into fists. I thought he was gone. Roy exhaled, shaking his head in disbelief. He wasn't. He was here. The whole time. The man looked down at Duke, his expression shattered. The dog gazed back at him with absolute trust, as if none of it mattered anymore, as if all that time spent waiting had simply been a test of patience, a test of love. I don't deserve you, buddy, the man whispered, voice raw. Duke only licked his chin. Roy swallowed hard, feeling his throat constrict. He had seen a lot of things in his life: loneliness, loss, quiet heartbreak that went unnoticed by the world. But this was something else. You taking him home? Roy asked, his voice gruff. The man nodded, but there was something hesitant in his expression. If he'll come. Roy snorted. He's been waiting for you all this time. You really think he'd turn you down now? The man let out a shaky laugh, rubbing his face before looking back at Duke. Come on, boy, he murmured, patting his leg. Let's go home. Duke hesitated. Roy's breath caught. For the first time since the man had arrived, the dog seemed unsure. He looked at Roy, then back at the man, his tail wagging slightly but his paws rooted in place. And then Roy realized Duke wasn't just waiting for the man. He had also been waiting for someone to notice him, to care for him. Roy had. The old man's throat tightened as Duke took a cautious step forward. The shepherd turned his head one last time, locking eyes with Roy. It wasn't a goodbye. It was gratitude. Roy let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He gave a small nod. Go on, boy. Duke stepped forward, finally pressing against his owner's leg. The man exhaled, his relief almost palpable. He gave Roy a long, knowing look. Thank you. Roy only shrugged. He did all the waiting. I just made sure he didn't starve. The man smiled, but it was lined with something deeper. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a weathered wallet. I owe you something. Roy held up a hand. Don't insult me. The man hesitated, then nodded. He crouched beside Duke, rubbing his ears. Come on, boy, let's go. The car door opened. Duke hesitated for just a second longer. Then, finally, he leapt inside. The engine roared to life, the headlights flicking back on. Roy stood still as the car pulled onto the road, its taillights glowing red in the distance. He watched as it disappeared down the highway, swallowed by the night. The gas station was silent again. Roy let out a breath, shoving his hands into his pockets. For the first time in a long time, he felt something settle in his chest. Not emptiness, peace. And maybe, just maybe, a little bit of faith. The road stretched out before them, dark and endless, disappearing into the night like a memory fading into the past. The old sedan hummed steadily, its tires humming against the asphalt in a quiet, rhythmic song. The man, Duke's owner, gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white against the leather. Duke lay curled up in the passenger seat, his body finally at rest, though his ears flicked occasionally, listening. The weight of the past few days pressed heavily on the man's chest. I never should have left you, he whispered, his voice barely audible over the steady thrum of the engine. "You waited for me, boy. All this time. And I just—" His voice broke, and he couldn't finish the sentence. Duke didn't move. He didn't need to. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was full of understanding. The man, his name was Evan, had thought about this moment for days, weeks, months. He had imagined it in 100 different ways, but none of them had felt real until now. It had taken a single phone call to unravel his life. That night at the gas station, when his phone had rung with the news of his brother's accident, he had gone into autopilot. He had driven as fast as he could, barely remembering to breathe. By the time he reached the hospital, everything else had blurred into insignificance. And Duke had been left behind. Evan had spent hours searching when he returned. He had driven through the town, posted online, called every shelter within 50 miles. But Duke had vanished. Eventually, Evan had forced himself to move on, convincing himself that someone kind had taken him in. That Duke had found a new home, a new family. But the truth had been far more heartbreaking. Duke had never left. For 7 long days, he had stayed in that gas station, watching the road, waiting for Evan to return. Evan swallowed against the lump in his throat, gripping the wheel tighter. "You're incredible, you know that?" he murmured. "I don't deserve you, bud." Duke sighed softly, shifting slightly in his seat, as if dismissing the thought entirely. Evan glanced at him, a small, bittersweet smile tugging at his lips. He had made a mistake, a terrible, unforgivable mistake. But Duke hadn't given up on him, and now it was Evan's turn to prove that he wouldn't give up on Duke. The first night back home was uneasy. Duke paced the small apartment, sniffing corners, inspecting furniture, hesitating in the doorway of Evan's bedroom. The place was familiar, but it wasn't right. It had been too long. The smells had changed. The air felt different. Evan sat on the couch watching him. "I get it, buddy," he murmured. "I don't feel like I belong here either." The truth was, home didn't feel like home anymore. Not after everything. Duke eventually settled down at the foot of the couch, but he didn't sleep deeply. He kept waking up, his ears twitching at the smallest sounds. Every time Evan shifted, Duke lifted his head, checking, watching, waiting. Evan saw it for what it was. Duke wasn't afraid of being here. He was afraid of losing Evan again. The guilt settled deep in Evan's chest, suffocating and relentless. How do you make up for something like that? How do you erase the scars of abandonment? The answer was simple. You don't. You prove, every single day, that you'll never make that mistake again. The adjustment wasn't easy. For days, Duke followed Evan everywhere. If Evan stood up, Duke stood up. If Evan left the room, Duke was right behind him. If Evan so much as reached for his car keys, Duke's entire body tensed, his eyes dark with silent fear. It was subtle, but Evan noticed it. The unspoken worry. The quiet need for reassurance. Duke never panicked. He never whined or barked. But his eyes, the same eyes that had stared down that empty road for days, told Evan everything he needed to know. He was terrified of being left behind again. Evan tried to be patient. He spoke softly. He let Duke sleep in his room, though the dog still hesitated before settling down. He took him on long walks, sat with him in the park, tossed a ball even when Duke barely had the energy to chase it. But the real test came one afternoon when Evan had to leave for work. He hesitated at the door, looking back at Duke, who sat near the couch, watching him. "I'll be back, buddy," Evan promised. Duke didn't move. Evan sighed. "You know I have to go." Still, nothing. Evan's chest tightened. He stepped forward, crouching down to Duke's level. "I swear," he said, voice barely above a whisper, "I'll come back." Duke blinked, and then slowly his tail wagged, just once. Evan smiled, scratching behind his ears. That's my boy." He left, and when he returned, just a few hours later, Duke was right there waiting at the door, his whole body trembling with excitement. The relief in his eyes shattered Evan completely. "I told you, bud," Evan whispered, sinking to the floor as Duke pressed against him, licking his face. "I told you I'd come back." And maybe, just maybe, Duke was starting to believe it. The weeks passed, the nightmares lessened, the hesitation faded. Slowly, Duke began to relax. He no longer flinched when Evan grabbed his keys. He no longer slept with one eye open. He started chasing the ball again, started playing, started living. And for the first time in months, Evan felt like he was healing too. He had spent so long believing that he had lost something irreplaceable, that his mistake had cost him the most loyal friend he had ever known. But the truth was, Duke had never left him. Not really. Even in the days apart, even in the miles between them, Duke had been waiting. And now? Now, they were making up for lost time. One morning, Evan woke up to find Duke curled up beside him on the bed, his head resting on Evan's chest, his breathing slow and steady. It was trust, a silent promise between them. Evan smiled, running a hand over Duke's fur. "I won't leave you again, buddy," he murmured. And this time, Duke believed him. The days blurred into weeks, and Duke finally seemed to settle back into his old self. The fear in his eyes had faded, replaced by the quiet confidence of a dog who knew, without a doubt, that his person wasn't going to leave him again. Evan had done everything to make up for lost time. They went on long walks every morning, just like they used to. They visited the park where Duke could run free, his powerful legs stretching as he chased after squirrels and leaves in the crisp autumn air. In the evenings, Evan would sit on the porch with a beer, watching the sky fade into shades of orange and violet while Duke lay beside him, his head resting on Evan's foot. They were rebuilding something that had once been unbreakable. And yet, one night, something changed. Evan was finishing up work late. He had picked up a few extra shifts at the warehouse, making sure he had enough saved up for the winter. The last thing he wanted was to struggle. Not now. Not when he had Duke back. By the time he pulled into the driveway, the house was dark, and the wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the crisp bite of an approaching storm. He killed the engine and stepped out, stretching his stiff muscles before walking up the steps to the front door. Normally by now, Duke would be there, ears perked, tail wagging, waiting for him. But tonight, the house was silent. Something was wrong. Evan's stomach twisted as he unlocked the door and stepped inside. Duke? Nothing. His pulse quickened. He set his bag down and walked deeper into the house. The living room was empty. The kitchen, empty. He checked the bedroom. Duke's bed was there, the blanket slightly rumpled, but the dog himself was nowhere in sight. "Duke!" Evan called, louder this time. Still nothing. A cold, sharp fear crept up Evan's spine. The door to the backyard was shut, but when he pulled it open and stepped outside, he felt the first sting of ice-cold rain against his skin. The storm was rolling in faster than expected, the trees swaying under the force of the wind. And then, movement. Evan's breath caught. A dark figure moved near the fence, just beyond the tree line. For a split second, he thought it was Duke. But as the shape shifted, stepping into the dim light of the porch, Evan realized it wasn't Duke, it was a man, and he wasn't alone. There were two of them, standing just beyond the fence, half hidden by the shadows of the trees. Evan's heart slammed against his ribs. He took a step forward, fists clenching. "Who the hell are you?" The taller of the two men chuckled, his voice low and rough. "Relax, buddy. We were just admiring your dog." Evan's blood ran cold. Duke. He hadn't seen him yet, but suddenly he knew. They had him. He took another step forward, barely able to keep his voice steady. "Where is he?" The second man, A wiry figure with sharp eyes grinned. "Oh, he's around. Beautiful dog, by the way. Strong. Looks well trained." Evan felt his hands shake, but not with fear, with rage. "Give him back." The taller man shrugged, as if this was some casual negotiation. "Look, man, no need to get all worked up. We just saw an opportunity. These purebred shepherds, they go for a lot of money. A well-trained one like yours? That's a gold mine." Evan could barely hear past the roaring in his ears. They had stolen Duke. They had taken him. And they thought Evan was just going to let that happen? The taller man took a step forward, smirking. "Now, I'll make you a deal." Evan didn't wait to hear the rest. He lunged. His fist connected with the man's jaw before he even had time to react. The man stumbled back with a curse, but Evan didn't stop. He shoved forward, slamming the guy against the fence, his fingers tightening around the front of his jacket. "Where is he?" Evan snarled, his breath ragged. The second man moved. Evan saw it out of the corner of his eye. A glint of something metal. A knife. Before the guy could bring it down, a blur of movement shot out from the darkness. A growl. A snarl of pure, unfiltered fury. And then, Duke. He hit the man like a freight train, his powerful body knocking him to the ground before he even had a chance to react. The knife clattered uselessly to the dirt as Duke's teeth clamped down on the man's arm, a deep, guttural growl ripping from his throat. The man screamed. Evan barely had time to process before the taller guy threw a wild punch, knocking him backward. Pain exploded in Evan's jaw, but he barely felt it, because Duke, his Duke, was standing over the man, his body low, teeth bared, hackles raised in a terrifying display of dominance. The second man clutched his bleeding arm, scrambling backward with wide, terrified eyes. "Get him off me! Get him off me!" Evan wiped the blood from his mouth, stepping forward with slow, deliberate intent. "You tried to steal my dog." The man kept shaking his head. We weren't serious, man. Evan's voice dropped to something ice cold. "Run!" The second man didn't need to be told twice. He scrambled to his feet, dragging his friend up by the collar, and together they bolted into the trees, disappearing into the stormy night. Duke didn't move. His growl rumbled low and dangerous in his chest, his entire body trembling with adrenaline. Evan took a slow, steady breath. Then, "Duke!" The shepherd turned, his ears twitching at Evan's voice. The second their eyes met, Duke's expression softened. His tail lowered slightly, his shoulders easing out of their rigid stance. Evan dropped to his knees, arms open. And Duke, without hesitation, ran straight to him. Evan buried his face into the thick fur of Duke's neck, his fingers gripping tightly, his breath shaking as relief washed over him like a tidal wave. "You're okay," he whispered. "You're okay, buddy. I got you." Duke let out a deep, exhausted sigh, pressing against Evan's chest, as if grounding himself. It was over. Evan didn't know how long they stayed like that, kneeling in the wet grass as the rain poured around them. But in that moment, nothing else mattered. He had Duke, and nothing was going to take him away again. The road stretched endlessly before Evan, the old sedan humming steadily as the rain began to patter against the windshield. The storm had rolled in faster than the weatherman had predicted, bringing with it a sense of unease that settled deep in Evan's chest. The sky was black, thick clouds pressing down on the world, swallowing every flicker of light from the distant city. Duke lay curled in the passenger seat, his body relaxed but his ears twitching slightly, attuned to every shift in the wind. He always knew when something was wrong before Evan did. And tonight, something was wrong. Evan's grip tightened on the steering wheel as he pulled onto the familiar gravel driveway. His house sat quiet and dark, save for the porch light flickering dimly, struggling against the relentless wind. Normally by now, Duke would already be up, waiting for him. Tonight, there was nothing. No welcome, no Duke. A cold hand clutched Evan's gut. He killed the engine, barely taking the time to yank the keys from the ignition before stepping out. The air smelled of damp earth, and the distant rumble of thunder vibrated through his bones. "Duke!" he called, stepping up onto the porch. No sound, no response. Evan's chest tightened as he shoved the door open. The house was eerily silent, save for the soft creak of the wooden floors beneath his boots. The living room was exactly as he had left it. Jacket draped over the arm of the couch, an empty coffee mug on the table. But Duke's bed, empty. A sickening thought twisted through his mind. Had he run away? No way. Duke wouldn't do that. Not now. Not after everything. Evan's pulse thundered in his ears as he stepped toward the back door. He could hear the wind howling now, rattling the windows. When he reached for the handle, his fingers felt ice cold. He twisted it. Locked. He hadn't left it locked. His stomach dropped. His hand shot to the porch light switch, flipping it on. The backyard lit up in an instant, revealing the rain-soaked earth, the swaying trees. And movement. Evan froze. There, near the fence, two shadowed figures lingered just beyond the tree line. The moment the light hit them, one of them stepped forward slightly, his features barely visible through the curtain of rain. Evan's breath came out in short, ragged puffs. "Who the hell are you?" His voice came out lower than he intended, edged with something dangerous. The taller man chuckled, a slow, lazy sound that sent a wave of fury through Evan's veins. "Relax, buddy," he said, shoving his hands into his pockets. "We were just admiring your dog." Duke. The name hit Evan like a gut punch. His fists clenched. He could barely keep himself from lunging forward right then and there. The second man, wiry and sharp-eyed, grinned. "Oh, he's around," he said, his voice oily with amusement. "Beautiful dog, by the way. Looks well-trained." Evan could feel his heartbeat in his skull. They had stolen Duke. They thought Evan was just going to let that happen? The taller man took a step forward, his boots sinking slightly into the mud. "Now, I'll make you a deal." Evan didn't hear the rest. He lunged. His fist collided with the man's jaw before he could react. The force sent him stumbling backward, his boots skidding in the wet grass. Evan didn't stop. He grabbed the front of the guy's jacket, shoving him hard against the fence. "Where is he?" Evan snarled, his voice barely human. The second man moved. Evan caught the glint of a knife out of the corner of his eye. The guy was fast. Too fast. The blade arced downward. Then, a blur of movement. A deep, furious growl split the night like a gunshot. Duke. He hit the man like a battering ram, his body a blur of muscle and raw power. The impact knocked the man off his feet, sending him sprawling onto his back, the knife flying from his grip. Then Duke's teeth sank into his arm. The man screamed. Evan barely had time to register what was happening before the taller guy, recovering from the punch, threw a wild swing. It clipped Evan's jaw, sending pain flaring through his skull. For a split second, everything tilted. But then, Evan moved. He tackled the guy back against the fence, slamming him down into the mud, fists flying. The second man was still screaming, flailing uselessly as Duke held him down, growling deep in his throat. "You tried to steal my dog," Evan spat, his breath ragged. The man beneath Duke whimpered, blood soaking into the sleeve of his jacket. We weren't serious, man. Evan pressed his knee into the other guy's chest, pinning him. "You think I'm an idiot?" The man kept shaking his head. "We were just—" Evan's voice dropped to something cold. "Run!" The guy didn't need to be told twice. He scrambled up, dragging his bleeding friend by the collar. Together they bolted through the trees, disappearing into the storm. Duke didn't move. He stood there, his body low, ears pinned back, his breath coming fast. His fur was slick with rain, his muscles still tense. "Duke!" The shepherd turned. his ears flicking at Evan's voice. Their eyes met, and Evan saw it. Recognition, relief, a silent question. Evan let out a shaky breath and dropped to his knees, arms open. Duke ran to him. Evan buried his face into the thick fur of Duke's neck, fingers gripping tightly, his breath shaking as relief crashed over him like a tidal wave. "You're okay," he whispered. "You're okay, buddy. I got you." Duke let out a deep, exhausted sigh, pressing against Evan's chest. It was over. Evan didn't know how long they stayed like that, kneeling in the mud as the rain poured around them. But in that moment, nothing else mattered. He had Duke, and nothing was going to take him away again. The storm raged on, its howling winds shaking the trees and sending sheets of rain across the yard. Evan stayed kneeling in the wet grass, Duke curled up against him, his large body pressing into Evan's chest, as if seeking solace after the terror of the night. The only sound that filled the space was the quiet, shuddering breaths of the man and his dog, the rhythmic pounding of rain against the earth, and the occasional crack of thunder that rumbled in the distance. For a long time, neither of them moved. Evan couldn't bring himself to stand. His body ached, his fists still tingling from the adrenaline of the confrontation, but it was the weight in his chest that was most overwhelming. Guilt, fear, and relief collided in a tangle of emotions that left him numb. He had failed Duke. He had left him, abandoned him in a moment of panic, thinking that he could come back and everything would be fine. And for 7 days, Duke had waited. He hadn't moved, hadn't left, hadn't given up. But Duke hadn't just waited. Duke had fought to survive. He had stood his ground, loyal and determined, even when the world had turned its back on him. And tonight, Duke had saved him. Evan stroked his dog's fur, feeling the steady rise and fall of Duke's chest beneath his palm. Duke's eyes were soft now, tired but filled with something that Evan could only call trust. It was the kind of trust that was earned, not given. Duke had forgiven him long before Evan could forgive himself. "I'm so sorry," Evan whispered, his voice hoarse. "I'll never leave you again." Duke gave a soft whine, as if to say, "It's okay. I'm here now." His eyes closed slowly, a heavy sigh escaping his chest as he relaxed into Evan's arms. It was as if, in this moment, the dog had released all the tension that had built up inside him. The fear, the loneliness, the anticipation of the one thing he had been certain of: Evan's return. Evan sat back, looking up at the dark sky. The rain was coming down harder now, but he barely noticed. He was too focused on the warmth of Duke by his side, the comforting weight of his dog's presence. The storm could rage on forever, but Evan felt an unwavering sense of peace settle over him. For the first time in months, maybe years, he didn't feel like he was running from something. His life had been chaos for so long. The constant moving, the work, the feeling of never really being home, the loneliness that had crept in without him even realizing it. He had buried himself in his job, in distractions. And for a while, he had forgotten what mattered. But now, here with Duke, Evan understood something he had never truly grasped before. He had everything he needed right here. He didn't need to search for peace or meaning or belonging. He already had it, by his side, loyal and true. Duke was his family. He was the constant, the one thing that had always been there, through all the highs and lows. The weight in his chest lifted slowly as he stood, gently helping Duke to his feet. His dog looked up at him with those deep amber eyes, and Evan felt an unspoken understanding pass between them. They didn't need words anymore. Everything had already been said in the silence of their bond. The storm was still raging when they stepped back inside the house. Duke hesitated for just a moment, his gaze flicking to the empty spaces in the living room. But when Evan gestured for him to follow, Duke obeyed, padding over to his bed in the corner. The soft blanket that had once been a lonely reminder of the emptiness Evan had felt now seemed like the safest place in the world. It was here, in this house, that Duke would find rest. It was here that both of them would find healing. Evan sat down on the couch, his back against the cushions, watching Duke settle into his bed. The dog curled up, his tail flicking once before he rested his head on the pillow, eyes half closed, exhausted but content. Evan couldn't help but smile as he watched him. This was home. This was the life he had been searching for. "I'm sorry I failed you, buddy," Evan whispered, his voice soft with emotion. "I promise you, I won't let you down again. We're in this together, from now on." The storm raged on, its howling winds shaking the trees and sending sheets of rain across the yard. Evan stayed kneeling in the wet grass, Duke curled up against him, his large body pressing into Evan's chest, as if seeking solace after the terror of the night. The only sound that filled the space was the quiet, shuddering breaths of the man and his dog, the rhythmic pounding of rain against the earth, and the occasional crack of thunder that rumbled in the distance. For a long time, neither of them moved. Evan couldn't bring himself to stand. His body ached, his fists still tingling from the adrenaline of the confrontation, but it was the weight in his chest that was most overwhelming. Guilt, fear, and relief collided in a tangle of emotions that left him numb. He had failed Duke. He had left him, abandoned him in a moment of panic, thinking that he could come back and everything would be fine. And for 7 days, Duke had waited. He hadn't moved, hadn't left, hadn't given up. But Duke hadn't just waited. Duke had fought to survive. He had stood his ground, loyal and determined, even when the world had turned its back on him. And tonight, Duke had saved him. Evan stroked his dog's fur, feeling the steady rise and fall of Duke's chest beneath his palm. Duke's eyes were soft now, tired but filled with something that Evan could only call trust. It was the kind of trust that was earned, not given. Duke had forgiven him long before Evan could forgive himself. "I'm so sorry," Evan whispered, his voice hoarse. "I'll never leave you again." Duke gave a soft whine, as if to say, "It's okay. I'm here now." His eyes closed slowly, a heavy sigh escaping his chest as he relaxed into Evan's arms. It was as if, in this moment, the dog had released all the tension that had built up inside him. The fear, the loneliness, the anticipation of the one thing he had been certain of: Evan's return. Evan sat back, looking up at the dark sky. The rain was coming down harder now, but he barely noticed. He was too focused on the warmth of Duke by his side, the comforting weight of his dog's presence. The storm could rage on forever, but Evan felt an unwavering sense of peace settle over him. For the first time in months, maybe years, he didn't feel like he was running from something. His life had been chaos for so long. The constant moving, the work, the feeling of never really being home, the loneliness that had crept in without him even realizing it. He had buried himself in his job, in distractions. And for a while, he had forgotten what mattered. But now, here with Duke, Evan understood something he had never truly grasped before. He had everything he needed right here. He didn't need to search for peace or meaning or belonging. He already had it, by his side, loyal and true. Duke was his family. He was the constant, the one thing that had always been there, through all the highs and lows. The weight in his chest lifted slowly as he stood, gently helping Duke to his feet. His dog looked up at him with those deep amber eyes, and Evan felt an unspoken understanding pass between them. They didn't need words anymore. Everything had already been said in the silence of their bond. The storm was still raging when they stepped back inside the house. Duke hesitated for just a moment, his gaze flicking to the empty spaces in the living room. But when Evan gestured for him to follow, Duke obeyed, padding over to his bed in the corner. The soft blanket that had once been a lonely reminder of the emptiness Evan had felt now seemed like the safest place in the world. It was here, in this house, that Duke would find rest. It was here that both of them would find healing. Evan sat down on the couch, his back against the cushions, watching Duke settle into his bed. The dog curled up, his tail flicking once before he rested his head on the pillow, eyes half closed, exhausted but content. Evan couldn't help but smile as he watched him. This was home. This was the life he had been searching for. "I'm sorry I failed you, buddy," Evan whispered, his voice soft with emotion. "I promise you, I won't let you down again. We're in this together from now on." The sun had nearly set, casting a warm golden glow across the quiet landscape. The world had calmed after the storm, leaving behind the scent of damp earth and the gentle hum of crickets waking to the evening air. Evan stood by the fence, hands in his pockets, watching Duke as he sniffed along the grass, his tail wagging ever so slightly. For the first time in a long time, there was no rush. No weight pressing down on Evan's chest. No unfinished business gnawing at the edges of his mind. There was just this moment with Duke by his side where everything felt right. It wasn't just about making up for the past anymore. It wasn't about guilt or regret. It was about moving forward, about choosing every single day to be better. For Duke, for himself. He had spent so long running, searching for something that he couldn't even name. And all along, the one thing that had truly mattered had been waiting for him. Loyal. Unwavering. And now? Now they were writing a new chapter together. Evan turned, clicking his tongue. "Come on, boy," he called softly. Duke's ears perked up, and without hesitation, he trotted over, falling into step beside Evan as they made their way back to the house. The warmth of companionship, of home, settled deep into Evan's bones. Before stepping inside, Evan glanced down at Duke, his voice quiet but steady. "We're in this together now. No more waiting. No more being left behind." Duke looked up at him, eyes filled with something deep. Trust, understanding, love. And for the first time in his life, Evan knew, without a doubt, that he wasn't alone anymore. To everyone watching this, right now, if you've ever known the love of a dog, you know that it is something pure, something unlike anything else in this world. Dogs don't ask for much. They don't care how much money you make, what car you drive, or what kind of house you live in. They care about you. They wait for you. They love you. But the sad reality is, not every dog gets a second chance. Not every loyal soul, like Duke, finds their way home again. There are countless dogs, abandoned and waiting, watching roads that no one will return on. Some are left behind intentionally. Others, like Duke, are lost because of a mistake, a moment of panic, a misstep that can never be undone. But you can make a difference. Right now, in shelters across the country, dogs like Duke are waiting for someone to see them, to take them home, to give them the love they deserve. If you've ever considered adopting a dog, this is your sign. Be the person that saves a life. Be the one who brings a dog home. Because as Duke's story has shown, dogs never stop waiting for us. The question is, will we be the ones to finally come back for them? Final words. Duke's story is a reminder of something we often forget in the chaos of life: loyalty, love, and second chances. It's never too late to make things right. It's never too late to come home. If this story touched your heart, please consider sharing it with others. The more people who hear stories like Duke's, the more dogs might get the happy endings they deserve. And if you want to see more stories like this, stories of resilience, loyalty, and the unbreakable bond between humans and their dogs, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Because in the end, it's not just about the stories we tell, it's about the lives we change. Thank you for watching.